Welcome back to our analysis of Brave New World. Last time we opened up with an analysis of the world state, and more specifically, how it biologically and physically develops its citizens. As opposed to being born through natural means, they are instead mass manufactured in factories thanks to the Bakanowski process, which allows everybody to be perfectly identical within certain social classes. Moreover, we looked at the social predestination that they have within this society, where they can do things like lower the oxygen levels in one's embryo, so that you'll come out being less intelligent or less capable than other social classes. They can do things like heat conditioning, which make it so that you will be born loving being in hot and humid places, which will make it perfect for your predestined role as a tropical worker. We saw how these tactics allow an individual to be conditioned before they're even born. In this second part, where we will analyze chapter 2 very closely, we'll see the second part of this development of the human within the world state by looking at the psychological development of humans. So let's look at the ways that the world state conditions people after they are born. An important concept to know is the psychological concept of classical conditioning, which you'll learn if you ever take a psychology course. This is absolutely something that you'll learn about. And you've probably already heard of it through Pavlov's dogs. The most famous pop culture example of this is in The Office, where Jim starts to do this very experiment on Dwight, where he keeps rebooting his computer, giving Dwight a mint, rebooting his computer, and it makes a sound, giving Dwight a mint, rebooting the computer, giving Dwight a mint, and then he reboots his computer, and Dwight holds out his hand without even recognizing why he's doing it, because he has been implicitly trained to pair those two stimuli together. So that's what classical conditioning is. In the experiment of Pavlov, he wondered whether if you associated or paired two stimuli together that have nothing to do with each other, like a bell and then giving the dog food, would that lead to the creature creating those associations? And so what Pavlov did is he gave his dog food, but every time, right before he gave food, he would ring a bell. And what he learned is after doing this a number of times, once he would ring the bell, before even bringing out any food or anything, his dog would start to salivate. And so he realized that there was an association between these two stimuli that was being formed. And so we're going to see this absolutely within the world state. And if you look at the very beginning of chapter 2 on page 19, I believe. Yep, page 19, you'll see the infant nursery is called the Neo-Pavlovian Conditioning Room. So there is a room in which they are doing classical conditioning on children. And so for most, through pages 20 through 23, we see that they use classical conditioning to pair electrocutions with flowers and books. So these babies, I'm not going to read these whole passages, but the babies are being given flowers, they're being given books, they're having fun with these things. And then all of a sudden, an alarm shrieks, a siren shrieks, and then the children are electrocuted. And so they start screaming, they experience these horrific feelings. Let's look on page 21 towards the bottom, and we get a little bit of explanation of what's going on here. So towards the bottom of the page, it says, offer them the flowers and the books again. So this is after they have done an association of electrocutions and sirens with flowers and books. The nurses obeyed, but at the approach of the roses, at the mere sight of those gaily colored images of Pussy and Cock-a-Doodle-Doo and Baa-Baa Black Sheep, the infants shrank away in horror. The volume of their howling suddenly increased. Observe, said the director triumphantly, observe. Books and loud noises, flowers and electric shocks. Already in the infant mind, these couples were compromisingly linked, and after 200 repetitions of the same or similar lesson would be wedded indissolubly. What man has joined, nature is powerless to put asunder. That last line is a pretty powerful explanation of the way in which our mind is subject to certain psychological principles, and through, say, classical conditioning, we could develop associations between stimuli to, say, make children feel horrified at flowers. This is, by the way, oftentimes how phobias emerge. If children repeatedly have bad experiences at the doctor growing up, they might grow up to have a phobia of doctors or needles or something like that. Now, most of the phobias people develop, or most of the classical conditioning pairing of stimuli that we have, are typically things that make sense. Like we see spiders, we're scared, so we start to develop a phobia of spiders, or needles, we get shots, they hurt, so we start to develop a phobia of needles. Those things make more sense. Obviously, here this feels should make us feel pretty uncomfortable. Turning something like flowers, making it a phobia or making it traumatic through the psychological concept of classical conditioning. Let's continue. They'll grow up with what the psychologists used to call an instinctive hatred of books and flowers. Reflexes unalterably conditioned. So notice that instinctive is being put in quotation marks, which implies it's not actually what's going on here, right? Rather than, I think one of the core principles or conceptions of humanity within Brave New World is that we are actually more governed by our environment, by nurture, than we are by nature, i.e. our pure just genetic makeup, rather than being governed by instincts that are unalterable. Instead, the world state has realized that you can actually engineer all of these aspects. If you condition us just right, change the oxygen levels in the embryo, do heat treatment to make us like being in really hot or vice versa, cold places, do things like classical conditioning when we're infants, you can actually develop or create what we would call instincts, right? You can develop reflexes that are conditioned and can't be changed after they've been set in stone, so to speak. They'll be safe from books and botany all their lives. The director turned to his nurses. Take them away again. So this seems a pretty horrifying, but nevertheless effective form of control to condition certain reflexes and impulses into humanity. What I find really interesting about this, though, is the justifications. And so skip a paragraph and let's keep reading, and you'll hear the justifications for why they're making kids not like books and flowers. I think we can imagine why a dystopian society like this wouldn't want kids reading books, but what about flowers? Why make kids hate flowers? And I think this tells us a lot about the world state. So I continue. One of the students held up his hand, and though he could see quite well why you couldn't have lower caste people wasting the community's times over books, and that there was always the risk of their reading something which might undesirably decondition one of their reflexes, yet, well, he couldn't understand about the flowers. Why go to the trouble of making it psychologically impossible for deltas to like flowers? Patiently, the DHC explained. If the children were made to scream at the sight of a rose, that was on grounds of high economic policy. Not so very long ago, a century or thereabouts, gammas, deltas, even epsilons had been conditioned to like flowers in particular, and wild nature in general. The idea was to make them want to be going out into the country at every available opportunity, and so to compel them to consume transport. And didn't they consume transport? Asked the student. Quite a lot, the DHC replied. But nothing else. Primroses and landscapes, he pointed out, have one grave defect. They're gratuitous. A love of nature keeps no factories busy. It was decided to abolish the love of nature, at any rate among the lower classes. To abolish the love of nature, but not the tendency to consume transport. For of course it was essential that they should keep on going to the country even though they hated it. The problem was to find an economically sounder reason for consuming transport than a mere affection for primroses and landscapes. It was duly found. We condition the masses to hate the country, concluded the director, but simultaneously we condition them to love all country sports. At the same time, we see to it that all country sports shall entail the use of elaborate apparatus, so that they consume manufactured articles as well as transport, hence those electric shocks. So, okay, the justification for making children hate flowers is on the grounds of economic efficiency and maximizing consumption. Flowers are a good symbol of something that is frivolous, or the word that is used here is gratuitous, something that doesn't really get us to consume or buy things, so it doesn't increase the productive capabilities of the society. It's not increasing the economic well-being of the civilization. This is something that, certainly probably has echoes into our civilization today. Think about every activity or hobby ends up getting commercialized and turned into a consumer activity to get you to buy more and more. How many activities do you do that don't have a vast, consumeristic impulse behind it to get you to buy more things? Certainly, we're bombarded with this message to buy more, consume more, buy more, consume more constantly, and we see the world state has that same type of justification. Moreover, I think the choice of a flower is really clever on Huxley's part. Think of the figurative associations of flowers. What ideas or connotations do flowers have? Obviously, they're a symbol of beauty and also a symbol of nature. And so if you think a little bit critically about what's going on here, flowers are a symbol of beauty and nature. If we take the opposite of that, because the world state is conditioning them to not like flowers, they're undermining those figurative ideas, then could we say this conditioning in some way, Huxley is trying to communicate that it's ugly? It's the opposite of beauty? It is unnatural? Certainly, I think we could get at the idea that it is unnatural. But hopefully you notice the severing of our connection with nature, which was such a big part of the literary landscape in the 19th century, kind of before the big literary movements before Huxley's own time, really emphasized trying to turn away from the industrial world and return to a more natural relationship with nature itself. We can see here that Huxley's vision of the future is pretty pessimistic about whether or not we'll actually achieve that. So, next, let's take a look at the world state's relationship to the concept of family, because this is something else that the children will be conditioned to. So, towards the bottom of the page, on page 23, we get some interesting and telling passages about how this society thinks about the concept of a family. And this should be surprising. They're going to be very horrified by the concept of a family. Now think about families within our own world. Don't we typically think of the family as being an important stabilizing force in civilization? Don't we think of the family as being really important for stability and for social cohesion? Why would the world state hate families? We don't actually get a lot of answers here. We'll get much better justifications in chapter 3, but it's a question that we should be thinking of as we're reading along. So, at the bottom of 23, it says, "And parent?" questioned the DHC. He's asking if the child knows what a parent is. There was an uneasy silence. Several of the boys blushed. They had not yet learned to draw the significant but often very fine distinction between smut and pure science. This is like in middle school when you're getting sexual education and the person says the word ovary and all the middle school children start turning to each other and giggling. That's the exact same idea that's going on here. But what is smut? Smut is like pornography. So it carries the connotation of something that is transgressive. So notice how bizarre and counterintuitive this is to ourselves, that the word family or the word parent is on the same level as something transgressive like saying the word penis would be to a room of middle schoolers today. One at last had the courage to raise a hand. "Human beings used to be..." He hesitated. The blood rushed to his cheeks. "Well, they used to be viviparous." Viviparous means giving birth naturally. So like getting pregnant and then giving birth. "Quite right," the director nodded approvingly. "And when babies were decanted, born," came the correction. Then they were the parents. I mean, not the babies, of course. The other ones." The poor boy was overwhelmed with confusion. This is a very humorous scene, but again, it's telling us so much about the world state. "In brief," the director summed up, "the parents were the father and the mother. The smut that was really science fell with a crash into the boys' eye-avoiding silence. So they all can't like look at each other in the eyes because this is so awkward to talk about. It's like if your parents ever tried to talk to you about sexual education. It's just so awkward. Mother," he repeated loudly, rubbing in the science. And leaning back in his chair, "These," he said gravely, "are unpleasant facts, I know it. But then, most historical facts are unpleasant." And skip down a paragraph. It says, "For you must remember that in those days of gross viviparous reproduction, children were always brought up by their parents and not in the state conditioning center." So again, we don't get a lot of explanation of why the notion of families and parents and children being born and raised by families is so horrific, but we certainly get a lot of insight into the values of this society that concept is repulsive to them. And we get a nice echo of this actually in chapter 3. So let's just go over there real quick. If you go to page 31 and 32, we can contrast this attitude about them thinking of families and parents as being transgressive with something that in our world feels very transgressive, but in their world feels totally, totally normal. At the very top of page 31, second page on page 3, it says, "Strange to think that even in our Ford's day, most games were played without more apparatus than a ball or two. And a few sticks and perhaps a bit of netting. Imagine the folly of allowing people to play elaborate games which do nothing whatever to increase consumption." So, okay, we're getting more evidence about the importance of consumption here within the society. If you go to the bottom of this page, you find that a nurse is bringing a boy aside. She's kind of bringing him to a specialist. And the director is like, "What's the matter?" said the director almost at the bottom of the page. The nurse shrugged her shoulders. "Nothing much," she answered. "It's just that this little boy seems rather reluctant to join in the ordinary erotic play. I'd noticed it once or twice before, and now again today. He started yelling just now." "Honestly," put in the anxious-looking little girl, "I didn't mean to hurt him or anything, honestly." "Of course you didn't, dear," said the nurse reassuringly. "And so," she went on, turning back to the director, "I'm taking him in to see the assistant superintendent of psychology, just to see if there's anything at all abnormal." And then look at the very bottom two paragraphs on this page. So this child, right, these kids were playing a sex game, which is like, what to us today, right? Ordinary erotic play out on the playground. Instead of playing kickball, they just do erotic play. Oh my God. And this kid didn't want to do it. And so that's seen as abnormal. Obviously, within our society, if a kid were to try to be doing erotic play on the playground at such a young age, we would be deeply uncomfortable with it. And that kid would be going to see the psychiatrist or a psychologist. Bottom two paragraphs of the page, though, again, we get some good conclusions about this. It says, "He let out the amazing truth. For a very long period before the time of our Ford, and even for some generations afterwards, erotic play between children had been regarded as abnormal." There was a roar of laughter. "And not only abnormal, actually immoral. No, and had therefore been rigorously suppressed." A look of astonished incredulity appeared on the faces of his listeners. Were little kids not allowed to amuse themselves? They could not believe it. So you can see that the attitudes surrounding sexuality are just dramatically different. Again, we need to be asking why? Why would this society want people to be going around constantly engaging in erotic play? Why would they want to break down these prohibitions and concepts of the family? Well, we know what the world state's highest value is. It's centered around stability and social cohesion. So how does this help to achieve that? That's a question we'll get an answer to in chapter 3, but you certainly should be thinking about it. Okay, let's return to chapter 2 now, and on page 25, we get the next big principle of conditioning here, which is the principle of sleep teaching or hypnopaedia. Now, okay, this isn't actually proven to work at all, so this is fictional. Huxley thought that governments would be able to figure out to make this work. This one ended up not being as prophetic. Okay, we got to give it to him. He was right about a lot of things. He was prophetic about a lot of things, but hypnopaedia, sleep teaching, doesn't actually really work. Though, great episode of Dexter's Laboratory, a childhood TV show that I was very fond of, that plays with this concept where Dexter is trying to learn French, and he says omelette du fromage, and then everybody thinks he's like fluent in French. Very funny. If anybody knows what Dexter's Lab is, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. But okay, let's look at how sleep teaching works. It's exactly what it sounds like. You know, you hear a voice over and over and over again, repeating a message, and then it gets solidified in your brain, and then it's just there. You know it without even recognizing that you know it. And this is very humorously captured through the boy who can say the Nile is the longest river in Africa and the second in length of all the rivers of the globe, but he doesn't actually recognize that he knows this fact. And so on page 26, we get a good explanation of how the world state uses this. They use it, actually, not for scientific education, but for moral conditioning. So on page 26, says that how the director made it plain discouraged the earliest investigators. The experiments were abandoned. No further attempt was made to teach children the length of the Nile in their sleep. So they're referring to how, when sleep teaching was first developed, they didn't think it was going to be very useful because the children didn't really truly comprehend the knowledge that they were learning. They could just blindly repeat it. Quite rightly. You can't learn a science unless you know what it's all about. Whereas, if they'd only started on moral education, said the director, leading the way towards the door, the students followed him, desperately scribbling as they walked and all the way up in the lift. Moral education, which ought never, in any circumstance, to be rational. That's a great line that captures the attitude of the world state, that moral conditioning should never be rational, or moral education should never be rational. It should just be something that is conditioned, something that is emotional. And I'm guessing most of you, as you see that sentence, have an initial gut reaction to that and say, that's wrong. I would definitely get you to contemplate how much within our own society we rely on truly rational moral education of really getting people to think about what is right, what is wrong, and get them to rationally come to a conclusion about why they think something is good or something is bad. Or how often do we just scold kids and say, don't do that, that's wrong, or do this, that's good? How often do we actually rely on purely conditioned or emotional attitudes in terms of moral education, of just asserting things are wrong? How often do we really sit down and explain robust rational justifications for our morals and our values? It's a question, a brief aside. We don't got to get in the weeds on that one now. But certainly the way that this society uses it, we get more evidence on page 27. We find out that the children are getting messages about their social location within the world and about what they're supposed to do with their social location. So, bottom 3 paragraphs on page 27, it says, "All wear green," said a soft but very distinct voice, beginning in the middle of a sentence, "and Delta children wear khaki. Oh no, I don't want to play with Delta children, and Epsilons are still worse. They're too stupid to be able to read or write. Besides, they wear black, which is such a beastly color. I'm so glad I'm a beta." There was a pause, and the voice began again. "Alpha children wear gray. They work much harder than we do because they're so frightfully clever. I'm really awfully glad I'm a beta because I don't work so hard. And then we are much better than the gammas and deltas. Gammas are stupid. They wear green. And delta children wear khaki. Oh no, I don't want to play with the delta children. And epsilons are still worse. They're too stupid to be able." So you can see here how these messages, conditioned and ingrained into these individuals, would lead them to accept their social location as being below other ones. So for instance, betas here are obviously below the alphas. And they're taught, okay, well, these alphas are really, really smart. I'm glad I'm not an alpha. They're so clever. They work a lot harder than we do. But as a beta, I don't have to work so hard, which is really nice. But thank goodness I'm not, a dirty delta or an epsilon because they're so dumb. And so it's really just conditioning and reifying these certain ideas within the individual. The director pushed back the switch. The voice was silent. Only its thin ghost continued to mutter from beneath the 80 pillows. "They'll have that repeated 40 or 50 times more before they awake, then again on Thursday and again on Saturday. 120 times, 3 times a week for 30 months, after which they go on to a more advanced lesson. Roses and electric shocks, the khaki of deltas and a whiff of asafoetida, wedded indissolubly before the child can speak. But where this conditioning is crude and wholesale, cannot bring home the finer distinctions, cannot inculcate the more complex courses of behavior. For that there must be words, but words without reason. In brief, hypnopedia. The greatest moralizing and socializing force of all time." So fascinating stuff here, right? We get, on the one hand, they do very crude classical conditioning through the electrocutions to make people have a physiological response, a physical response when they see something like flowers or books. But then for moral education, they use this sleep teaching, hypnopedia, to just blindly get people to accept certain ideas and words without reason, without thinking about it. And so that's what moralizing and socializing forces are within the world state, is blind conditioning. And at the bottom of the page, we get a really interesting metaphor for how this conditioning works. It says, "Not so much like drops of water, though water, it is true, can wear holes in the hardest granite." They're saying that this conditioning isn't like breaking through or breaking down an individual. This isn't destructive. It's not destroying something. No, rather, it's like drops of liquid sealing wax, drops that adhere, encrust, incorporate themselves with what they fall on, till finally the rock is all one scarlet blob. What does that metaphor get at? It gets at a sense of envelopment, of a difficulty to penetrate. It's about building something as opposed to just destroying something. You can imagine the sealing wax enveloping, enclosing, becoming impossible to penetrate. It becomes like a protective layer around the individual. Till at last the child's mind is these suggestions, and the sum of the suggestions is the child's mind, and not the child's mind only, the adult's mind too, all his life long, the mind that judges and desires and decides, made up of these suggestions. But all these suggestions are our suggestions, the director almost shouted in his triumph, suggestions from the state. So we can see the sealing wax metaphor establishes how effective the conditioning by the state is and encrusts the mind until the mind is the suggestions given by the state. So, okay, by the end of chapter 1 and by the end of chapter 2, we have a very clear vision of how the world state conditions people both before they are born and after they are born, so that they are perfectly obedient subjects of the world state. Again, I'm guessing right now you all feel deeply, deeply uncomfortable with the tactics the world state is using. But the question we'll have to explore in the next chapter is why they are doing this. Obviously, it came to social cohesion, but what happened within the world to justify the creation of the world state and to justify for individuals giving up the liberty and freedom that they so clearly have, that they had before the creation of the world state? We'll get that in chapter 3, and along the way, again, you should always be questioning, even though your gut tells you that this is wrong. Really try to be asking, well, why? Is this world actually so horrific? Is there some way or some justification by which we could see the world state as being preferable to the world that we live in today? These are questions, obviously, that are going to be in the back of our mind throughout most of these lectures until we get to the final chapters, in which Mustafa Mond and John the Savage have their big philosophical debate about these questions. But certainly it is something that you should be stewing over and thinking about as you're working your way through these.